Put one thing on a blank page. It's easy to get lost in an empty space. I'm far from the first person to reflect on how the possibility and the peril of a blank page can lead to paralysis, how the endless expanse and innumerable options can render us inert. And really, that's not even the extent of it, because beyond these somewhat material concerns lies a swamp of conceptual quandaries like figuring out intent, worrying about being interesting, and managing identity, a mire of dilemmas, considerations, and pitfalls that can make every step a struggle and threaten to bog things down in doubt and ego. But not today. Today we will put aside all of this and concern ourselves with learning some of PowerPoint's most basic functions, with avoiding and disabling some of its automation, and in the process, engage with some rudimentary yet powerful graphic design approaches. But first and foremost, we will concern ourselves with putting one thing on a blank page. And even what that exact one thing is, with minimal constraints, is mostly irrelevant. Initially, though, our primary concern is making a completely blank slide. To do this, we will first start a new presentation by selecting Blank Presentation from the New options. Then, by right-clicking on an empty portion of the slide, we can mouse over Layout and select the Blank option from the second drop-down pane. This, by default, will result in a white background. If you prefer a black background, because blank can be either black or white, simply right-click on an empty part of the slide and select the Format Background option. This brings up to the right of the slide the Format Background pane. From here, we can use the paint bucket icon to turn our slide black. And if for some reason there are still any graphic elements on the slide, we can usually get rid of those by checking the Hide Background Graphics checkbox. Once we've done that, I recommend clicking the Apply to All button at the bottom left of that pane. Now, the thing we plan to place on our blank slide can be pretty much any graphic or text element, so an image, a figure, a word, or a phrase. Ultimately, though, what we need is for this thing to be as singular as possible, meaning as much as it's fine for it to have elements, individual words, values, and such. Anyone who sees it should be able to look at it and identify it as a single thing, so no collages or bullet lists. Another consideration is that the thing we place on the slide must be visible against the background we've chosen. We can describe this in terms of contrast, meaning in this case we're looking for the greatest possible contrast between our object and the background. So if we're placing text, the text should be black if on a white background, or white if our background is black. To insert a text box, select the text box icon from the drawing section of the Home ribbon, then click anywhere on the slide, and what we type will appear in a text box. By default, the text will be black, so if we're on a black background, we'll need to change the color of the text in order to see it. We can either select the text we have typed, or after you've selected the text box icon and clicked on the slide, but prior to typing, we can select the small chevron on the right-hand side of the font color icon, which itself is at the bottom right of the font section of the Home ribbon. In the menu that appears, choose the white square so that any text we add will appear white. If we're using a figure like a diagram or a graph, it may mean we need to reconsider our slide background. The easiest choice would be to make the background of the slide roughly the same brightness as the background of the figure. So if it's a graph with a light background, then set the slide background to white. Also, if we're placing a figure or an image that employs a broad spectrum of colors, a white background is generally the safer option. To insert a graphic element into PowerPoint, select Insert, which is the third menu item in the top row of menus. This will change our Home ribbon into the Insert ribbon. Try not to get too lost in all the insert options. Just pick something. And again, for the sake of this exercise, the thing we have placed on the slide should only take up a portion of the slide. We should aim for the thing to take up no more than, say, 1/6 of the full area of the slide. Think of a slide as being divided into 3 columns with 2 rows. So if our object is bigger than approximately 1/6 of the slide, we should shrink the object. For most graphic elements in PowerPoint, other than text, changing the size of an object involves selecting the small circles called anchors, which are located on the object's bounding box, the dotted line box that surrounds an object. These become visible anytime you click an object. So while holding down the keyboard Shift key and placing the cursor on any corner anchor, we can then hold down the left mouse button and drag the anchor either towards the center of the object to shrink it, or away from the center to make it larger. We're holding the Shift key in order to make sure we don't change proportions as we change size. As a rule, hold the Shift key when resizing objects. Before we can resize text, we will first need to make sure PowerPoint's text size automation is disabled. Right-click on the bounding box and choose Format Shape. In the panel that appears, again to the right of our slide, select Text Options, then the text box icon, which is the rightmost option of the 3 icons in the second row. And then below that, select Do Not Auto Fit. We can then either select all of the text within the text box by holding down the left mouse button and dragging the cursor across all of it, or by placing the cursor anywhere in the text box and typing Ctrl-A. Or actually another alternative is to simply select the bounding box. We can now enlarge or reduce the size of the text by, in the font section of the Home ribbon, selecting either the font size from the numerical box to the right of the font name, or by using the font reduction or embiggen icons that are just below that. So now we should have a single thing on a blank slide that takes up approximately 1/6 of the available space. It's absolutely worth it to take a very short moment and observe how this changes our perception of the space. The first thing worth noting is that by adding just one thing to a space, we add proportionality to that space. An empty space is amorphous and infinite. By adding just one thing, we introduce a sense of scale and bounds. In other words, the space could now be considered to be an area approximately 6 times the size of what we've added. The thing we've added also further defines the space by occupying an identifiable position within it. It's either on the left or on the right, near the top or near the bottom, or possibly right in the middle. Something else very much worth noting too at this point is we have established what constitutes positive and negative space. If our object is primarily black or dark, then dark is now seen to represent presence or positive space, which would make white represent absence or negative space, the inverse being true for a white object on a black background. What this means in design language is that we have determined for our design what is figure and what is ground. A simple way to think of figure and ground is to envision an object against a sky. If it's a daytime sky, then the sky will be light, so the figure will be as substantive as it is dark. But if it's a nighttime sky, then the figure's visibility will depend on how much light it reflects, so in turn how bright it is. So what we've ostensibly chosen is whether our presentation will occur against the background of day or night. And of course you can extend this metaphor as far as you like, as in, is this presentation an attempt to illuminate the darkness or build something in the light? Or not, it's really not that important. What is important is that we make this determination of figure and ground the rule for our entire presentation. We've made a design choice, and we should only change that if, in changing it, we say something meaningful about our content. Otherwise, we stick to the rule because randomly switching figure and ground can quickly get both visually fatiguing and kind of annoying. The next thing we should do is further define the space by adding guides. Right-click anywhere on the slide other than on the thing, and then from the drop-down menu select Grid and Guides. Then if it's not already selected, select the checkbox for Display Drawing Guides on screen, and then OK. On our screen, we should now see a faint dotted horizontal and vertical line. These are the aforementioned guides. If we place our cursor over either of the guides, we should see the cursor become a two-sided divided arrow, either up-down for the horizontal guide or left-right for the vertical one. Left-click on our thing so as to reveal its bounding box, and then move the cursor to left-click, hold and drag the vertical guide to line it up with the left side of our thing. We should then repeat this by lining up the horizontal guide with the bottom of the thing's bounding box. Next, we should create additional guides by holding the Control key while moving one of the existing guides. For instance, if we place our cursor on the vertical guide, hold the Control key and the left mouse button while dragging the guide to the right side of our thing's bounding box, we should have created a copy of the original guide. We should now have a guide on both the left and the right side of the box. Repeat this with the horizontal guide, only this time adding the new guide to the top of the bounding box. Now, there are a couple important things to know about guides. One, they do not appear in the final presentation. They are exclusively design tools and only appear in PowerPoint's normal view. The second thing is that once added, they appear in the same position on every slide. So for instance, if we were to create a new slide by typing Control-M, we would see that both the number and position of our guides are consistent. Going back to our original slide, now we should add a second thing to that slide. What I would strongly recommend is that if our initial thing was text, that we add something graphic and vice versa. So now we should have a plain slide with two things, a text thing and a picture/figure/graph sort of thing. Having two things in a space means we can observe and describe how those things relate not just to the space, but to each other as well, as in thing 1 is above thing 2 or to the right of thing 2 or so on. We can also compare the size and shape of thing 1 and 2, as in thing 2 is bigger, takes up more space, or is squarer or rounder or more rectangular than thing 1, or thing 1 and thing 2 are relatively quite similar in shape and size. A simple choice would be to do this, to make both things approximately the same size and align them horizontally on the slide with a small vertical gap between them. Think of the space between them proportionally as like mortar between bricks. We can then align the text to whichever side is closest to the other object, meaning if the graphics on the left of the text box, align the text to the left. We do this by again selecting the text bounding box and selecting Align Left from the Paragraph section of the Home tab. If the graphic is instead on the right, align the text to the right by selecting the Align Right icon. To this point, we've actually been working with two fundamental concepts of visual design. These are alignment and proximity. These terms are, I think, pretty self-explanatory, but can be quite robust if we choose to explore them. What they do in this case is create the sense that these two objects, by virtue of being roughly the same size and aligned in space, are also aligned in meaning and purpose, unified and coherent. If that's not the case, or the intention, we can create contrast by changing the size, shape, or position of either object. But for the time being, let's keep them aligned. Next, we repeat the earlier process with the guides, this time using them to frame the size and position of both things on the slide. What this does is formalize our choices, so as we create new slides, we can see how the size and placement of our new content relates to our grid, and by virtue of that, all of our prior content. In other words, the grid allows us to observe alignments between as well as within slides. At this point, making the rest of the presentation is ostensibly iteration and experimentation. Add slides, and one thing at a time, add things to those slides. Move things around and observe the relationships implied both by their position in space and relative to other objects. And each time we add an object, we should add guides around that object. And of course, we're not bound to having only two objects or exclusively blank backgrounds. We're free to change any portion of our presentation as we see fit. However, each time we add something to a slide, we should consider how it alters other objects and the space itself. In our slides, what relationships are implied and how objects align or contrast with each other and the space. This process of carefully and deliberately placing content onto blank slides may seem rudimentary, and at first it's slow, but that's part of the point. Learning to see space and organizing content in space requires taking some time, slowing down, and navigating rather than avoiding the blank page. PowerPoint does a lot to help us quickly populate slides, but in doing so, all but eliminates the possibility of purposeful, intentional use of space. This choice to begin from the fundamentals of design, though, to take time to explore contrast, alignment, and proximity, this is what will give us the capacity to create slides that not only contain content, but help describe it, meaning our slides will not only look better, they'll actually say something. If you want to go deeper into this, I would highly recommend designer Robin Williams' book, The Non-Designer's Design Book, but otherwise, just keep making slides, one slide and one thing at a time.